AI agents are a hot topic, but what does an agent actually mean? Some, it's a smart chatbot, while to others, it's a very bespoke and complex system of different agents actually speaking to each other and working together on a common goal. In this video, I'm going to go through these different perspectives and explore the spectrum of definitions for what an AI agent is based on our real-life experience working with clients actually implementing them in practice. If you don't know who I am, my name is Mark, and I've been running my own AI automation agency called Prompt Advisors for the past 2 years. My team and I work with companies in every industry to better understand where AI fits best in our clients' workflows. I've worked in the data science and machine learning space for the past 10 years, and we've had a lot of practice implementing different tiers of agents for different tiers of organizations and specialties. What I'm first going to do is lay the foundation and define what agentic even means, and then go through the spectrum of different solutions that can fit within the realm of that word. I'll then go through the current flaws with more complex agent systems and go through my take on what I think it'll take to get to truly bulletproof agent systems that work with very high reliability. Let's dive right in. So what does an AI agent even mean? If we ask our friend Google, Agentic can refer to a number of things, including AI system, automation approach, and it listed quite a few more possible definitions. Some keywords here that pop up is that they can autonomously pursue complex goals and workflows with limited human supervision. And then another thing here is it says it adapts to decisions based on changing conditions. So pretty much new inputs that come up very iteratively and dynamically. And the last portion here is it can perceive their environment, reason, and formulate actions to achieve goals. So that is the overall definition of agent. Now, for the purposes of the generative AI space, whether it's because of naivete or startups trying to raise a lot of money, all kinds of things are now regarded as agents, whether it's a very basic chatbot with a knowledge base or a very complex system or a swarm of different agents. So my hot take on this is that you can't necessarily say anymore that something is an agent or is not an agent. To me, it's more so a continuum. So instead of a binary definition that this thing is an agent because of XYZ, to me, it's how much of an agent is it, or how agentic is it? So if you take the perspective that a lot of these generative AI tools and new frameworks are somewhere on that spectrum, it'll help you better understand the differences between them and what is the missing gap between where we are right now and where we need to be to actually have end-to-end automated systems. So again, I like to think of the definition of not just agentic or not agentic, but how agentic is this tool? And if we take an actual spectrum and we go from low agency to high agency, we can start to plot different tools. And obviously this is my perspective on where I'd plot them. But for the most part, the one thing that the majority of folks will agree on is that we don't have necessarily an easy off-the-shelf option that is a fully high agent, fully autonomous system that works with any API or any backend or any system. Starting off from low agency, we have the basic chatbot, which now pretty much has some form of very basic prompt, the ability to upload some knowledge or link your website to it, and then it can answer any input with a resulting output that's using a reference material of your website, your knowledge files, etc. The next step up from that are things like VoiceFlow or BotPress that you can call agent builders, or I would used to call chatbot builders, where you can have a knowledge base, you can have a more bespoke conversational design, but you can add tools to it. You can add different workflows that execute different automations. So this is where you start to move down that spectrum of slightly more agentic in nature. Now, for those tools to be executed, for those workflows to actually work, there is some form of triggering the conversation where the user says something that shows some form of intent and it triggers those things to actually be executed. One step further are automation workflows. And you can think of things like Make.com, Zapier, or N8N, where you can build a somewhat deterministic system with sprinkles of generative AI where it makes the most sense. It's not that the entire system is driven by generative AI. It is just being used in certain areas where it makes sense, where maybe you take some input or output and you put it in natural language. So with these kinds of workflows, you can really mix and match. So you can imagine, what if you have some form of automation that's listening in for LinkedIn posts from creators that you follow. And then based on their posts, you generate some form of comment based on the other comments that are in that thread. So you can see there, you're programmatically going to LinkedIn, scraping the actual posts, going through the comments and actually iterating through them, and then feeding that some language model to come up with what is the best comment for me to add to this current conversation. 80% of those steps were actually programmatic in nature, and the last 20%, that last mile, was driven by generative AI. What makes this slightly more agentic, in my opinion, is the fact that you have many inputs that can trigger this workflow, and it can adapt to different conditions if you can start accounting for it in the underlying automation. So you can have multiple different triggers that execute that workflow end to end, and as things come up or as models kind of swap and get more advanced, it's very easy to swap the intelligence of the certain nodes you're looking for, or kind of prune your automation and make it much more succinct as things get more powerful and you can do a lot more with less. The next step up, in my opinion, is custom GPTs or the equivalent using something like Claude projects, where you have a large language model that on its own has its own functionalities. So right now, ChatGPT has vision, it has voice, it has text, and as of 2 days ago, it now has text to video as well. So you have the whole cohesive suite of tools at your disposal, and you can hook up to custom actions like automations, like custom code, etc. So as you go down the spectrum, you're having a much stronger base that is powerful on its own, and then it becomes an octopus where you can add different tools, different actions, different workflows that make it that much more powerful. And if you're curious what can be done with custom GPTs and making them some sort of agent, I recorded a video almost a month ago called ChatGPT Agents, where I basically showed you what's possible by creating a multi-agent infrastructure just using custom GPTs. As we get closer to high agency, now we deal with more complex frameworks like the Assistance API from OpenAI, Claude's newer MCP model, computer use, which allows you to basically let Anthropic use your computer and take screenshots in real time, and then position the character in a certain place to execute workflows of your choosing. Again, here, you basically have a large language model as your base, and then you have different functions that are being executed, or tools, if we want to simplify it. The magic here is that you have some sort of prompt that is indicative enough that based on certain inputs from a user, the model knows whether or not it should use certain tools or not. And like before, like the custom GPT, now this becomes higher leverage because you can use make automations, you can use custom code, and you can take advantage of these language model bases to integrate with pretty much anything. And the fact that you can create threads on the fly like you would in a ChatGPT conversation allows these kinds of applications to be used pretty much ubiquitously anywhere that has an API and some form of chat interface where someone can go back and forth. In the last cohort of agentic tools, I'll name almost kinda agentic buffet. And you'll understand why I'm saying that shortly. But one thing before I move on is that these two here, the custom GPT and the assistance framework, pretty much have one thing in common, where there is technically a human in the loop, where there is some user input back and forth. And as you see results kind of working or not working, you have the ability to change on the fly, but that change or that changing on the fly is not being done autonomously by that tool. It's being done by intervention by you, the user or the owner of said agents. For now, most clients we work with at Prompt Advisors, we recommend to always have a human in the loop until we get to the point where you can truly trust these systems to take care of themselves. Okay, so if we go to the kinda agentic buffet, you'll see that ever since ChatGPT came out, we've had tons of different frameworks that claim to be the solution for creating autonomous agents. Out of all of these frameworks, none of them I would say are perfect, but the ones that are more robust are LangGraph by LangChain, and then there's a newer framework called Agency Swarm by another creator on YouTube named Envision. The reason why we like Agency Swarm more than a lot of these other frameworks is that it allows different agents to speak to each other in a much more productive and cohesive way, whereas things like OpenAI's Swarm that came out a few months ago is a bit underwhelming in its ability to really control the agent's input to output and how that information is transferred between each other. That being said, again, there is no perfect solution as of today that works end-to-end bulletproof with 100% uptime and 100% accuracy. And if you're wondering what are some of the flaws that come up consistently with these kinds of frameworks, the agentic-ish framework is sometimes you have prompt misinterpretation. And this is something that's very common in all kinds of applications, where you have some form of prompt, and as you run it 10 times, 20 times, 100 times, you eventually get some form of error rate, where you have 10% of cases where the prompt is for some reason misinterpreted and has an output that is atypical to everything you've seen. And this is what we call, again, hallucination. Can this be mitigated? Absolutely. Are higher level models less likely to hallucinate? Yes. Now, the problem with using higher level models is that while they are more robust and hallucinate less, they're way more expensive to actually run, If you want to add guardrails on top of that or add different agents that act as guardrails, things start to add up very quickly. And the cost-benefit analysis of actually doing this versus just automating 80% of your workflow using a workflow tool, it's very hard to justify as of today. The next thing is tool use misinterpretation. So maybe the agent understands your prompt correctly, but it actually uses the wrong tool or executes the wrong workflow, either by misinterpreting or by actually misinterpreting the user actually speaking to it, what they're looking to accomplish. The next portion is tool use malfunctioning. So imagine your agent responds properly, knows exactly what it's doing based on the prompt. It chooses the right tool, but then that tool misfires or it has a timeout error or something happens that's funky. And that funky response now pretty much breaks your whole workflow. Or if there's a multi-agent and there's an agent depending on this output, you have a problem. And the last one is agent-to-agent miscommunication. So in the scenario where you have multiple agents that are relying or are dependent on each other's inputs and outputs, when you have agents hallucinate when they're talking to each other because there's no uniform language per se, this becomes another problem. But with these different pitfalls, the biggest thing is when you have a tool or a function that is misfired, misused, or misinterpreted, that's where things start to really fail, and you have a whole system of failure that becomes a very negative feedback loop. Now, with one agent having these errors is a problem, for sure, but imagine the case where you set up multiple agents using, let's say, GPT-4o, which is not the smartest model, but probably the most quote-unquote affordable model to use with agents at scale. Imagine you have 6 different agents. Maybe one is good for social media. One takes the social media posts and optimize it for SEO. One actually takes it and actually publishes it to the different domains. And with any, if even all of these agents, you are prone to any one of these 4 errors happening at any one time. And now if we go one layer deeper, now imagine these agents are now communicating with each other with either incomplete, misinterpreted, or wrong information. And then again, this is where your negative feedback loop at scale really grows, along with the underlying cost to actually run these agents. And even if you get them to reflect or have quote unquote chain of thought, where they look at their output, reflect on it, and then feed it on to the next portion, this all adds up. And when things go wrong, it's very hard to troubleshoot where that issue is coming from. So just to sum up what we went through so far, we have chatbots with wings. So let's say chatbot builders or agent builders that let you execute workflows based on intent. And then you have automation with generative AI sprinkles, where you have maybe an 80% programmatic, deterministic, or static automation that has very predefined things, and 20% of it are composed of generative AI modules that either translate things in natural language, generate copy based on inputs, etc. Then we have custom GPTs and their equivalents like Claude projects. Then we have large language model frameworks plus tools and function calling. And then we have the agent-ish frameworks I just went through that have the right idea, but not necessarily the right tooling or LLMs to really get it right end to end. So in theory, what would the perfect agent look like, or the perfect agent swarm look like? It could look like a collaborative system similar to this. So imagine you have something like stock reordering, and this is a retail business, and you have an agent that manages and restocks to maintain inventory levels. And then you have another agent that acts as a QA or an auditor of the data to make sure anything in the stock data is being double and triple checked before it actually goes through that system. And then we have another layer of error checking that now checks whether or not the data was properly cleaned, right? So you can imagine there could be chain of thought at every stage here. Now you could have summarization, where you have an agent that condenses or summarizes information that you've now pre-cleaned and you've double checked that it's actually accurate, and then it feeds it into an inventory monitoring agent. And then you have another agent that its sole job is to do demand forecasting. So now this becomes a positive feedback loop. The most important component, as you will have seen, is the fact that the data is clean, it's been double checked, and every input and output in this whole process is being double and triple checked. At a very low level, if you want to think of a very basic infrastructure of an AI agent swarm, you would have, let's say, 3 different agents, each of which with its own respective system prompts, and then some tools. Those tools could be make automations, Zapier automations, custom code. It could be pretty much anything that has an API integration. This is the basic structure. Now, the ironic idea is that as these agent frameworks become more and more like corporate companies where there's layers of quote unquote management, that's where you get more bespoke automations and swarms. So the supervisor agent model is where you have multiple employee agents that could have their own tools and prompts, but then these sets of employees have their own bosses that micromanage and actually check their outputs to make sure they're hitting certain bars, they're thinking the right way, they're outputting in the right format, etc. And just like a bigger corporation, you can get to hierarchical agent systems, where now you don't have just one layer of management, you have multiple layers of management, where maybe all the main employees, the lower level agents, are figuring out task allocation based on some input. And based on the task allocation decided by these agents, you have some more bespoke and intelligent agents that decide what tools do we need to invoke or what functions do we need to use to accomplish X. And then you have the smartest agents or the most sophisticated agents at the bottom here that take advantage of the task allocation decided upon by these lower level agents, the tools decided upon by these second layer agents, and their role is to now look at it at a 50,000 foot view, be very thoughtful of what automations should be executed, in what order, and they take the process to the natural end. As you get even more corporate and get more hierarchical, you can now having different divisions and departments of these agents. So ironically, we're going to eventually have swarms of agents that are very much mimicking our structures of old of how we do human capital right now, especially in larger corporations. So in this case, you can have a whole committee that identifies the goals of the entire agent organization, and then there could be consultant agents that double check the rationale of the initial agent sub goals. And then if it's a financial case, there's some form of APIs that are called to double check some numbers. Based on the numbers, you have a feedback loop that adjusts the initial plans here after all of this process. And then after the thing is executed, you have the final corporate executive agents that learn from the outcomes and make some form of change in the environment or state of the initial agents or somewhere down the line to improve the likelihood that this process is even better the next time. This is what I regard as a fully agentic system. That is kind of like the end of the spectrum, the end goal that pretty much a lot of these companies are working towards. And like you saw there, the ideal workflow is that you have some form of performance reflection after the task is executed. Any weaknesses or any flaws in the outputs are consistently kind of learned from, and there's a feedback loop to improve for next time. And then you have strategy refinement, objective setting, and all of this eventually will be done autonomously. What do I think it will take to truly get to that point? And this is purely my hot take. If you saw the most recent release by OpenAI, the GPT Pro, yes, it's unbelievably expensive. It's eye-wateringly expensive. I did subscribe to it just to see how it works. It did do something very thoughtful, where some of the tasks that I gave it, it thought from 3 to 5 minutes. And the output was honestly a lot better than the normal O1 model or even the GPT-4o model. It was like leaps and bounds way better than that. Now, while ChatGPT Pro isn't going to be necessarily the answer to getting to that end-to-end system, it is a step in the right direction where eventually maybe the language models themselves, when they become cheap enough, when they become reliable enough and they're not constantly in beta, they can reflect on their own output. And eventually being able to have multiple of these agents that are very thoughtful in their outputs could get us to a point where hallucination is very much mitigated. And if we have, let's say, common language between these agents, then their ability to communicate will be enhanced and it'll be a lot more battle ready and production ready. So if we look at the possible future of what an AI agent structure or DNA might look like, you'll have a very comprehensive retrieval system where you can upload knowledge base files, probably of almost infinite context length, and it will not just memorize it or reference it. There will be something more bespoke where maybe it does understand it at some level. And it's not just scanning a question to a match in a document, especially as this progresses more and more. The next is right now, a lot of these chatbots or agents, they have a knowledge base. And what happens in a knowledge base is you ask a question, it looks for a match to that question. There's no consumption or digestion of that information. So perhaps eventually we become more separating of knowledge and reasoning, where there is some reference material, but then there's some reflection on, is this the right piece of material that I should be retrieving based on the question and based on everything else that I have at my fingertips to choose from, where the retrieval is more thoughtful now. Next thing here is more of an outlandish idea, which are negotiation frameworks. So what happens when you have 10, 15 agents and they're disagreeing on the path forward? How do you decide who is better, who wins that argument to actually execute their specific workflow? That's one thing we're going to have to figure out as well. The last two are contextual data. So making sure that the agents are always focused on the matter at hand and the input of relevance. So if you give it something like 20 pages, it's really good at looking through that 20 pages and looking for what is the actual snippet here that aligns with the core goal that I have to accomplish my end state. And the last one, like I outlined before, is perfecting inter-agent communication. If there is a standardized language between different agents, that's when there's more reliability, that you can now not only have a singular agent not hallucinate on its own, but now you can make sure they don't hallucinate when they're talking to each other, because there's a common language, there's a common way of doing things, and there's a common way of negotiating, so this becomes all standardized. I tried to keep this as high level as I possibly could to make sure that you could follow along and for this to be accessible to as many people as possible, because as things progress, the definition of what an agent is will continue to be blurred. But if you use this idea of a spectrum, you'll better understand how Agentic is a certain solution and how much can you trust it, especially when we know we're not fully at that end-to-end infrastructure just yet. If you found this video helpful, let me know down in the comments below. If you have other ideas or thoughts, or if you have your own definition of Agentic that I didn't get to cover here that you think is really important, feel free again to comment it down below. I love learning from all of you, and hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you all next time.